everybody. I'm happy to join medical student, second year in medical College of Medicine and at the College of Pharmacy, whom join us in the series of lecture in the physiology of cardiovascular systems. The previous lecture we discussed the physiology at the level of the cellular level. So discussed that the action potential of the cardiac muscles and automaticity at these lectures. And if you remember, the action potential stage 0 is a rapid depolarization due to the fast opening of fast channel sodium channel, and then stage 1 early repolarizations in which the influx of potassium outside. Then the more important stage in the plateau stage. This plateau stage is due to the influx of calcium ion inside the cell. And then last stage of repolarization, then resting stage 4. These 5 stages important when you study the antiarrhythmic classes. You will find that each class it's act on the certain phase, 1 or 2 phases of cardiac action potential. And then we study the second part of the previous lecture is the physiology at the level of isolated muscle fiber. So study the sliding theory, sliding filament of actin, myosin filament for contraction and relaxation. Also, we study that phenomena of excitation coupling, contraction ECC, which is we define as the converting electrical events to contractions event. And they study the phenomena of the calcium-induced calcium release, which is in the cardiac muscle. And at that time, if you remember, we discussed some differences between the cardiac muscles and the skeletal muscle. The cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, both of them striated, but the cardiac muscle short, branch and unite, and have intercalated disc, which is not present in the skeletal muscle, and uninucleated also. And the calcium in the cardiac muscle have two sources, from the outside the cell and to the inside the cell. That's why calcium comes from the calcium channel. Some of it trigger induce of sacroplasmic reticulum, while the calcium in skeletal muscle only from sacroplasmic reticulum. And there is a plateau phase in cardiac muscle. This plateau not present in the skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle right away contraction, depolarization, repolarization. In this day we're coming to study at the organ level is the cardiac cycle. What mean by cardiac cycle? It's a main function of the heart as organ, and this function is contained mechanical, electrical events. These mechanical, electrical events and change in a volume and pressure in one cardiac beat is called cardiac cycle. And the cardiac cycle have divided in two main parts. Is a relaxation diastole or diastolic phase and systolic phase in contractions. So cardiac cycle refer to all events, electrical and mechanical, change in a volume and pressure associated with the blood flow through the heart during cardiac beats, one cardiac beats. Systole, as we said, contraction of the heart, diastole, relaxation of the heart. Contraction both atria and ventricle, and relaxation both four chambers. And these phases for the descriptions of cardiac cycle. We will discuss every phase of this and what happened in that phase. Atrial phase due to atrial contraction and isovolumetric or isovolumic contraction, what is mean there is a contractions of the ventricle without change in the volume. And there is the filling of the ventricle from the blood in atria by two phases. Rapid phase with about 80% from whole blood, enter that the ventricle right and left due to that the opening of that the AV valve. While the last phase is that the reduced ejection, which is due to that the contraction of atria. Isovolumetric or isovolumic relaxation is a period at the end of the systole, and then rapid, at the end of diastole, then the rapid filling and the rapid and reduced filling of the ventricle. These 7 phases, no need to remember the numbers, only phases of the cardiac cycle. So the cardiac events that occur from the beginning of one heartbeat to the beginning of next heartbeat called cardiac cycle. And as we say, there is a mechanical element and this is electrical element. Usually electrical element preceded by a fraction of millisecond the cardiac and mechanical element. So systole is the time during which the cardiac muscle contracts, atria and ventricle, while diastole time during which cardiac muscle relax, atria, ventricle. These some terms you have to know it before starting study of cardiac cycle. Left ventricular in diastolic volume. At the end of diastole, the venous return is the left ventricle. Please note, we discussed cardiac cycle in the left side of the left ventricle. Left ventricle, right ventricle, the same events happen in the left and right with some differences in the pressure and timing. Otherwise, the same event happen in the left and right. Left ventricular end systole volume, at the end of systole remaining some amount of the blood not ejected, called left ventricular end systole. What ejected called stroke volume, that which pump in each cardiac cycle, each cardiac beat, in each stroke of the heart. Stroke volume can we find it mathematically by subtraction in diastolic volume minus in systolic volume, ml, we will find it 70 ml. So normal adult stroke volume in a resting state, not exercise, is the 70 ml. So each cardiac cycle is initiated, as we know, by electrical event, by spontaneous generation of an action potential in the sinus node, SI node, natural pacemaker. This node is located, as we know, is the superior lateral wall of right atrium, near the opening of superior vena cava. The action potential travel from from SI node rapidly through both atria and then through the IV node to the bundle into the ventricle and Purkinje system. Because of this special arrangement of conducting system from atria into the ventricle, there is some delay in the AV node, more than 100 millisecond or 0.1 second during passage of cardiac impulse from atria into the ventricle. Give a time for diastole to filling the heart. This allows the atria to contract ahead before contractions of the ventricle and the ventricular contract, thereby pumping some blood into the ventricle before the strong ventricular contraction and ejection of the blood. Really, the atrial chamber, as we said, is the thin wall, low pressure, and it acts as a container, as a tank, as a primer pump, as a conduit for the ventricle, that is passage of the blood from this chamber. And the ventricle in turn provide the major sources of power for moving blood through the body and pulmonary circulation. And the communication starts really from SI node, from one cell depolarize, and from this cell is spread to the other cell by junction gap. And this is in a cardiac muscle. As we said, cardiac cycle, electrical event ahead before contractions, and then mechanical event which called contraction, with change in the pressure and volume in 4 chambers. And this is to see that the SI node and that the contractions and the interatrial and SI node depolarization and the electrical to the atria, from atria to the AV node to the both ventricle to be, this is just to remind you how that the conduction, our conductive system to start, this is electrical part of the cardiac cycle. There is a relation of electrocardiogram. Really, when we discuss cardiac cycle, see what happened in ECG, what happened in a cardiac sound, what happened in the pressure and volume of each chambers with timing. And some of the notes, really we will discuss cardiac, ECG, or electrocardiography in separate lecture. But it's better to understand this before starting the discussion in a detailed cardiac cycle. There is a wave and the intervals in the ECG. They are electrical voltage generated by heart, really ECG, and recorded on the surface of the body. And look to the contraction and the depolarization of atria give the P wave, both left and right. And the depolarizations of the ventricle before contraction a few milliseconds give a QRS complex, while repolarization of the ventricle give the T wave. Repolarization of atria is the negligible electrical activity that is not recorded in the surface ECG. We will see when discuss ECG there is a wave like PQRS complex, T wave and U wave sometimes there, and there is interval and the segment. PR interval now here, QT interval from Q to T, and this will discuss in the coming lecture just to know nomination of these. And this is ECG paper. Look, there is a big square contain 5 small square. This is important. We'll study it in the coming lecture, how to calculate the rate and know that the duration of each wave. This is a P wave due to that the atrial depolarization. This is QRS complex due to the ventricular depolarization, and this is T wave due to the ventricular repolarization. And that the PR interval from P to R and QT interval, and there is a segment, PR segment and ST segment, and this is called QRS complex. I think it's easy for a time being to know these term on this wave and interval only. No need to know the normal for a time being. This is in the coming lectures. So there is a wave, P wave, atrial depolarization, not contraction. QRS complex, which is ventricular depolarization. T wave is that the ventricular repolarizations. And the segment PRST and interval PR and the QT interval. See, mechanical events lags behind, slightly behind electrical event. This means there is a depolarization, then contraction. There is a depolarization, then contraction. Depolarization end, few milliseconds, then contractions and mechanical end after that. So the P wave is caused by spread of depolarization through the atria, and this is followed by atrial contractions, which causes slight raise in atrial pressure. We will see in the atrial pressure curve when we study it. Immediately after the electrocardiograph P wave, about 0.1 second or the 100 to 160 after the P wave, the QRS, this is in AV node delay. QRS complex appear as a result of electrical depolarization of ventricle, which initiate the contraction of ventricle and causes ventricular pressure to rise a very high level, even to reach 80 or more, and at that, this electrical activity preceded the contraction of ventricle. Therefore, QRS complex begins slightly behind the onset of ventricular systole. Finally, we observe the ventricular T wave in the electrocardiogram. This is represent, as we said, stage of repolarization of ventricle. when ventricle muscle fiber begin to relax. Therefore, the T wave occurs slightly before the end of ventricular contractions. This graph for cardiac cycle, we study that the pressure volume in a graphic. This graph very important. We return it every part of the study, every part of the cardiac cycle. For a time being, is the ECG we study. So this is phase, systole, and this is diastole. This is 7 phases. First phase is the atrial contraction, so it is P wave. Atrial depolarization is the P wave, and then atrial contraction. So this is a P wave. While to start ventricular depolarization from here, and this is the QRS complex. While ventricular repolarization, there is a T wave. So there is this curve really is the event in a time. Whole cardiac cycle is 0.8 second, about 800 milliseconds. And this is that the event. We will study heart sound, pressure, and volume, valve. In every stage, we return to the very important curve of the cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle explained by mechanical curve and the graphically. And for a time being, we know that the atrial depolarization is the P wave, ventricular depolarization, QRS complex, ventricular repolarization is the T wave. That's enough for a time being. This is the same graph. We will return it back. This is the P wave for atrial and the QRS complex for ventricular depolarization and T wave due to the ventricular repolarizations. The cardiac cycle has been divided into the following phases. Atrial systole contraction, as we said, atrial systole, depolarization, then contraction. Isovolumic or isovolumetric ventricular systole. It means that the ventricle contracted and the pressure increased sharply while the volume is not changed. Ventricular ejection, and this ejection of the blood from ventricle, we say it's stroke volume, have 2 phases, early ejection and late ejections. Then stage of isovolumic or isovolumetric, better meaning isovolumic. And at the ventricular relaxation, it means there is a change in the pressure and no change in the volume. Pressure drop down from the 80, more than 80 to near the 0, while that the volume is not changed. Then rapid ventricular filling due to the opening of the atrioventricular valve, bicuspid and tricuspid, and pushing of the blood from atria. As we said, it is a conduit, as a reservoir of the blood, and the diastasis. Each part of it's about 100 milliseconds. But the last part is the heart in the resting is about 200. If we divided each part of these 6 parts with early and late, it will find 100 in a time. This is 200, the longest phase of diastasis. The cardiac cycle of right heart and the left heart are similar, as we said, although not identical. For one ventricle, our arterial pressure 3 to 4 times greater in the left heart than in the right. What does mean? The pressure, in the left side of the heart is the 3 to 4 times. It reaches to maximum to the 80 and more than 80. In the right side, maximum 20 or the 25. So it is 3 to 4 times the pressure higher in the left side. There are also important differences in timing between the 2 pumps. Otherwise, they are similar but not identical. So we'll discuss cardiac cycle in the left side of the heart in detail, which is similar to that in the right side. We'll see differences at the time of discussion. So atrial, this is the 6 main phases: atrial systole and the isovolumetric systole and contraction, and then the ventricular ejection isovolumetric relaxation, and the filling of the heart. And this is the diastasis, the longest phase, about 200 milliseconds. This is 100, 200, 300, 5, then it's 800 about, and the ejection 2 parts, 700, 800 millisecond, all the cardiac phase. This is in detail we'll study in the coming lectures. The atrial systole after it inlet valve, which means atrioventricular valve open, passive ventricular filling, diastole first, inlet close due to the nearly wide, then isovolumic contraction when the 4 valve close, then aortic and pulmonary valve open, and ejection systole, and the outflow valve closures, I mean aortic pulmonary isovolumic relaxation. We'll discuss in this heading in the next coming lecture. This is your homework for this lecture. Please print this and label it. The wave and interval in this. This coming in one examination at what time? Do labeling, please. See you soon in the next lectures.